The threat came on a biting West Virginia autumn day. Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. The menacing words still rang in Italian immigrant George Sodder's ears months later that Christmas, 1945. But surely the assurance of his nice new home, decorated merrily just weeks before, couldn't become prophetic. After all, life for George, wife Jenny, and their 10 kids was good now. His transportation business afforded them a spacious timbered house atop a Fayetteville hillside. The holidays had brought most of them back together, except for their second oldest son Joe, 21, who had left home to serve in the military during the Second World War. But in the earliest hours of Christmas Eve, everything changed forever. It was Christmas Eve 1945. Most families were still fast asleep, eagerly awaiting the joy that a new day would bring. But one family in Fayetteville, West Virginia, awoke to every parent's worst nightmare. Their home was on fire, and 5 of their 10 children were trapped inside. The Sodder home was aglow from a festive tree and lights strung about the property. Inside, parents George and Jenny had just headed off to bed, letting their gleeful children play a while longer with new toys before tomorrow's big day. Christmas tunes rang through the living room, where a few of the kids were winding down. It was a Rockwellian American scene, except not all was as peaceful as it first appeared. Just after midnight, Jenny was suddenly awakened by the night's first strange occurrence, an anonymous phone call asking for an unfamiliar name. Raucous laughter and clinking glass sounds behind the mystery woman's voice. Suspicions raised, Jenny quickly hung up, shaking off the odd encounter. Jenny also noticed the older kids failed to lock up downstairs when they turned in. She secured the doors and windows, presuming everyone had gone to bed, and she quickly fell back asleep. Shortly after 1 a.m., a loud crash abruptly woke her once more. An object had loudly struck the house's roof. The sound of someone pounding the shingles repeated in her account. Unity and innocence were ripped violently from the Sodders in mere minutes by malevolent forces targeting their family and muffling all cries for help. Jenny first stirred to screams and choking fumes invading their rest. Chaos quickly ensued through the home as George and other kids awoke, choking from noxious fumes. Racing to make their way downstairs, the burgeoning fire forced them to run as fast as they could. Thoughts immediately went to where the other 5 children had last been seen, now surrounded by raging fire. Desperate screams and pleas rang out into the freezing night, but only silence returned, the roar of flames growing louder by the second. How had the fire spread so swiftly and already gotten so out of hand? Something was gravely wrong here. Every attempt to save the children, trapped behind raging curtains of flame, proved futile. As the group anxiously huddled outside, George grabbed for hidden house keys to drive his work truck against the house wall so the family could climb atop its bed. But both the truck and recently used car failed to start, their engines strangely now dead. The home's phone and even emergency number direct lines were found severed for some odd reason. Screams into the night for help seemed only answered by wood crackles growing louder, and someone had suspiciously stolen the family's ladder from its usual place. Meanwhile, the home was collapsing floor by floor, its roof now caving into the basement inferno where the children had last been seen. Within 45 minutes, their home had burned to ash and embers. By sunrise, a smoldering pile of rubble was all that remained of the large Sodder house, and hope 5 of their babies had endured. Emergency crews sifted through still steaming debris until noon, but found no human remains before calling off search efforts. By Christmas Day, local authorities had ruled the tragedy an accidental fire from faulty wiring. They gently urged the Sodders to accept their catastrophic loss, but George and Jenny were tormented by odd events in the preceding days and strange discoveries in the ruins. Had this been an accident, Or was something far more sinister at play? It was the eerie events before the fire that first seeded doubts that something sinister was lurking outside the Sodder family's quiet Christmas celebrations in 1945. In the months before the tragic Christmas, the Sodder family had a series of peculiar encounters. First, a man approached George at home asking for work, then gestured to the house's wiring, saying, "This is going to cause a fire someday." He denied this himself, having just had the wiring inspected and approved. Later, an insurance salesman threatened the home would go up in smoke after George refused policies. A week prior to the incident, the older sons witnessed a strange car parked on the main highway close to town, while it intently observed their home before speeding away unidentified. Once the dust settled from the devastating fire, new troubling findings emerged. The phone technician revealed the home phone's wires had not simply melted in the blaze, they were deliberately cut, explaining the dead line. A thief also admitted to stealing George's block and tackle during the fire after police arrested him, though he denied broader involvement. And weeks later, daughter Sylvia found a hard green rubber ball in the ashes, the strange object Jenny heard loudly strike the roof at the first sign of trouble. George noted its resemblance to an incendiary grenade. Later, found inexplicably cast down a steep embankment, 75 feet from the house, as if thrown by sinister hands, was the ladder. Most chilling, a witness recalled seeing mysterious fireballs cascading onto the home's roof, rather than flames bursting from within. And while authorities stood by faulty wiring as the culprit, they perplexingly rescinded their initial claim to have found faulty wires. If this hadn't been an accidental electrical fire as claimed, was something or someone more sinister to blame? George and Jenny carried on in mourning, burying 5 little caskets in a family plot, all empty. But 2 years later, a photograph in Look magazine stirred a stunning realization. It showed a group of children at a holiday resort, and one little girl bore an uncanny resemblance to Betty Sodder, right down to a distinct patch of hair missing from her forehead. George and Jenny had become convinced that their children had been abducted, and the fire set to cover the crime. The couple pored over the case, finding police had strangely never issued missing children alerts. The fire marshal had also lied about unearthing a child's heart in the wreckage, in what he called a bid to give them closure. And the house had burned down with impossible speed and ferocity, pointing to an accelerant. All fingers began pointing to arson and a possible kidnapping plot gone horrifically awry. But could their beloved children really still be out there, alive? In the decades since, the ultimate fate of the missing Sodder children has never been determined. There is persuasive evidence on both sides as to whether the tragic fire claimed their lives, or if a more sinister, organized hand was responsible for their disappearance. Post the fire, little remained but embers. The fire chief himself could not maneuver the sole engine on site, later citing this as impacting search capabilities in the crucial aftermath needed to locate remains before they degraded past recognition. Even more consequential to securing evidence, George bulldozed 5 feet of soil over the ruins, going against the inspector's advice to let search teams sift through debris. But days turned into years, with no follow-up examination occurring. George's own emotional act blinded best chances to unearth remains, possibly concealed below, in a misguided effort to consecrate ground holding his baby's last breath. If the children did perish, then the primitive firefighting response that night and the hasty bulldozing of the site may have obscured or destroyed any remains. However, there were found to be lumbar vertebrae from an older individual that showed no evidence of fire damage. The report concluded they likely originated from a nearby cemetery through soil George had spread over the site. In the fire science, can explain the lack of recoverable bone fragments, so the vertebrae fragments remain an enduring mystery today. But if the fire was intentionally set, perhaps to cover the very alive children's kidnapping, then who was responsible and why? The Sodder family believed organized criminals were at play in retaliation for George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini, an unpopular stance among Italian immigrant communities of the time. Police supposedly had information on vagrants eyeing the home, and George maintained he was threatened at his business as well. Others suspect the work of local mafias around Smithers, West Virginia, where the immigrant Sodder family first put down stakes after arriving at Ellis Island. Perhaps George still had enemies lingering from those early days. Records show that insurance was a possible motive too, with policies suspiciously taken out on the property shortly before the fire. But definitive proof remains frustratingly lacking. And though authorities stated he'd fully cremated the children's remains, Jenny agonized over how household artifacts and tin roof fragments strangely did survive the inferno. Her amateur fire experiments burning animal bones never fully reduced them to ash either. Even a crematorium worker insisted human skeletons withstand even lengthier, hotter fires than the Sodder home collapse. It defied precedents that only small bodies had vanished so completely. Hope the missing children lived alternately surfaced too, and reported sightings by witnesses near and far. In 1947, a photo in a magazine showed a Florida hotel hosting families of 5 earlier that year. One girl eerily resembled daughter Betty. Same crooked stare, same odd forehead scar from a childhood injury. Then, in 1968, a mysterious envelope arrived devoid of a return address. Inside, she uncovered a faded photograph of a man, aged beyond little Lewis's 9 years. Yet his wistful eyes held the indelible spark of her son. Crude handwriting on the reverse made her heart shudder. Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. ILIL boys, A90123 or 35. Though authorities dismissed it as exploitation of suffering, maternal wisdom convinced Jenny that this was a message from her lost son, reaching across the decades from whatever lonely path he went into. Nearly 80 years later, the disappearance of the Sodder children stands as one of American history's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. George and Jenny Sodder went to their graves in the late 1980s, still desperately searching for answers, certain their children had been cruelly stolen away on that fiery Christmas night in 1945. And we may never learn the whole truth of what really transpired in those West Virginia mountains. The story of the Sodder family is a heartbreaking testament to every parent's drive to find answers and seek justice at any cost. George and Jenny spent much of their remaining lives chasing phantom leads across the country, believing their children were out there somewhere. That spark of hope kept their spirit alive even decades later as age took its toll. And the couple would no doubt find solace that public intrigue and debate around their family's tragedy shows no signs of dying out. Nearly a century later, armchair detectives still pore over evidence old and new. Were the missing Sodder children tragically claimed by a dreadful Christmas Eve fire? Or are the secrets behind their disappearance still waiting to be unraveled? After all this time, perhaps we may never fully know. But at this time of year, the one certainty is that the Sodder family's story will continue capturing hearts and minds for generations still to come.